After spending my career studying how empires rise and fall, something I witnessed recently in the Caribbean completely changed how I think about American power in the world. When Russian warships showed up in Venezuelan waters, they did something far more significant than just positioning themselves strategically. They essentially destroyed a principle that has governed politics in this part of the world for 2 centuries. The Monroe Doctrine, America's core claim that the Western Hemisphere belongs to Washington's sphere of influence, effectively died in those waters. The disturbing truth is that most Americans have no idea this happened. What occurred was more than just ships moving around. This was the moment when the unipolar world order I've studied my entire career truly started breaking apart. The question isn't whether America saw this coming. The question is why we forced it to happen. Let me walk through how a superpower accidentally destroyed its own backyard. Picture Russian warships anchored off Venezuela's coast, conducting joint exercises with a nation America has tried to strangle economically for over 20 years. Cable news called it provocation. Pentagon officials released statements about destabilizing actions, but they missed what was really happening. This wasn't Russian aggression or expansionism. This was Russian reciprocity. For 30 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, I watched Washington make the same fatal mistake over and over. Every time we expanded our sphere of influence, we told ourselves it was about democracy and freedom. Every time Russia protested, we called it paranoia and aggression. But the logic of power doesn't care about our moral justifications. When those Russian ships arrived in Venezuelan waters, they were answering a simple question. If NATO can expand to Russia's borders, why can't Russia expand to America's? The logic was elegant. The timing was perfect. The message was unmistakable. The era of unchallenged American dominance is over. It started with hubris. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, America stood alone as the world's sole superpower. We had won the Cold War. Fukuyama declared the end of history itself. Liberal democracy had triumphed permanently. Instead of building a new security architecture that included Russia, we chose supremacy. Instead of creating institutions that reflected post-Cold War realities, we expanded the very alliance designed to contain the Soviet Union. I remember the debates in the 90s. George Kennan, the architect of containment, warned that NATO expansion would be the most fateful error of American foreign policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He understood what Washington refused to see. Russia, regardless of who led it, would view NATO forces on its borders as an existential threat. But we pushed forward anyway. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, then the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania. Each wave of expansion was framed as spreading democracy. From Moscow's viewpoint, it looked like encirclement. The pivotal moment came in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest. There, the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members. For Russia, this crossed a red line. Ukraine isn't just another neighboring state. It's the historical heartland of Russian civilization. The first Russian state was founded in Kiev. The idea of NATO missiles stationed just a few hundred miles from Moscow was intolerable to any Russian government. But Washington assumed Russia was too weak to respond, too dependent on Western systems, too consumed by internal problems. We were wrong, and Venezuela would pay the price for our miscalculation. While we were expanding NATO eastward, we applied the same logic of dominance in our own hemisphere. Venezuela became our laboratory, our testing ground for how far economic warfare could go before a country breaks. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he committed what Washington considered the ultimate sin. He decided that Venezuela's oil wealth should benefit Venezuelans rather than American corporations. He invested oil revenues in social programs, healthcare, education. He built relationships with Cuba and promoted Latin American independence. From that moment on, he was marked. The pattern was predictable. First came diplomatic pressure and moral condemnation, then economic sanctions and financial restrictions. When those didn't work, we backed a coup attempt in 2002. It failed, but the message was clear. After that, the relationship between Washington and Caracas became open warfare. When Maduro succeeded Chavez in 2013, our strategy was fully formed. Economic strangulation designed to create desperation. We cut Venezuela off from international financial systems. We blocked oil sales, their economic lifeline. We froze billions in government assets held abroad. The human cost was catastrophic. Venezuela's economy collapsed by over 75%. Inflation reached unimaginable levels. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Food became scarce. John Bolton, while serving as National Security Advisor, openly acknowledged our intention to cause maximum economic pain. Tens of thousands died as a direct result of our sanctions regime. Millions fled the country. But the government didn't fall. Instead of achieving our objective, our pressure accomplished something we never intended. It drove Venezuela straight into Russia's arms. This is where Putin demonstrated the difference between tactics and strategy. While Washington focused on destroying individual enemies, Moscow was building a global network of resistance. Russia looked at Venezuela and saw opportunity where we saw defiance. A country under American sanctions, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, desperate for allies. The opportunity was perfect. The partnership developed gradually. Russian energy companies invested billions in Venezuela's state oil company. Technical advisors arrived, then military experts. Moscow provided fighter jets, air defense systems, tanks. Then came the naval visits. Since 2008, Russian warships have periodically docked in Venezuelan ports. Initially, these were symbolic gestures. Now, they're strategic statements. Each visit sends the same message. If you can put forces on our borders, we can put forces on yours. The symmetry was perfect. For every missile system installed in Eastern Europe, a Russian warship appeared off South American shores. For every alliance formed near Russia, a counter-alliance emerged in America's traditional backyard. But Russia's involvement offered more than symbolism. Under our sanctions, Caracas desperately needed economic lifelines, technical expertise, diplomatic recognition. Russian oil companies helped keep production going. Russian advisors trained Venezuelan personnel and maintained critical infrastructure. The partnership became one of necessity rather than ideology. That's what made it unbreakable. What we failed to understand was the pattern. We weren't just pressuring individual countries. We were creating a coalition of the coerced. Every nation we sanctioned, isolated or threatened, became a potential partner for our rivals. Venezuela joined a growing club. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba. Different systems, different ideologies, but united by one thing. They had all been targeted by American pressure. Their cooperation emerged from survival instinct. With every country we added to our sanctions list, that network grew stronger. We forced our enemies to find each other, to trade with each other, to protect each other. We created the very alliance we claimed to fear. The genius of Russia's approach was recognizing the pattern and exploiting it. While we tried to isolate enemies one at a time, Moscow was building a parallel system, one that could function entirely outside American control. China provided economic foundation through massive trade relationships and alternative financial systems. Russia provided security guarantees and energy partnerships. Iran contributed expertise in sanctions evasion. Together, they created a world where survival was possible without American permission. Venezuela was the crown jewel of this network, proving that even in America's own hemisphere, alternatives existed. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, asserted the Western Hemisphere as America's exclusive zone of influence. For 2 centuries, that assertion held. No European power could establish permanent presence in the Americas without American consent. But doctrines only work when you can enforce them. And power, as I've learned through decades of study, is always relative. When those Russian warships arrived in Venezuelan waters recently, they weren't just conducting naval exercises. They were performing a funeral for the Monroe Doctrine, for American hemispheric dominance, for the illusion that geography still provides protection. The world has changed in ways Washington refuses to acknowledge. We now live in a multipolar system where influence must be earned rather than assumed, where partnerships are voluntary rather than coerced. Russia's message was simple but devastating. The Western Hemisphere is no longer America's exclusive domain. Other powers can project influence here too. The era of unilateral dominance is finished. What makes this moment so significant is how it exposes the fundamental contradiction in American foreign policy. We maintain roughly 800 military bases in over 70 countries. Our fleets patrol every ocean. We spend more on defense than the next 10 nations combined. We justify this as global leadership, as maintaining a rules based order. But when Russia puts a few ships in the Caribbean, suddenly it's aggression. When we build alliances, it's collective security. When others do it, it's expansionism. This double standard hasn't gone unnoticed. To much of the world, America's rules based order looks like a system where the rules apply to everyone except us. We invoke sovereignty when it suits us and ignore it when it doesn't. The hypocrisy is staggering. We denounce election interference while funding opposition movements. We condemn authoritarianism while arming dictatorships that serve our interests. We demand other nations respect international law while flouting it whenever it constrains us. People remember the coups we sponsored in Guatemala, Chile, Argentina. They remember the death squads we trained. They remember how we supported dictators as long as they were anti-communist and undermined democratic governments that challenged our dominance. So when Washington claims to care about democracy in Venezuela, few believe it. The world has learned that America's commitment to democracy is conditional, applied when it aligns with our interests, abandoned when it conflicts. What we're witnessing isn't the sudden emergence of new threats. It's the predictable consequence of imperial overreach. For 30 years, we've tried to maintain global dominance through force and pressure, but pressure creates resistance, and resistance eventually finds expression. Every intervention, every sanctions regime, every military deployment has consequences, not just economic, but strategic and moral. We spent decades lecturing others about freedom while denying it to those who make choices we disapprove of.
The tragic part is that none of this was inevitable. After the Cold War, we had a historic opportunity to build a cooperative world order based on shared prosperity and mutual respect. Instead, we chose dominance.
We could have integrated Russia into European security structures. We could have worked with China on global challenges. We could have partnered with Latin America instead of trying to control it. Instead, we expanded military alliances, imposed crushing sanctions, and conducted regime change operations. We mistook our temporary advantage for permanent supremacy.